Have I waited too long? Has the gold bull market run its course? That's the next logical question, of course. And I answer that these days by uh, telling people what would cause me to sell my gold. And that's pretty easy. I think maybe they popularized the idea that government and efficiency weren't competing concepts. Uh, but no, they didn't accomplish anything. They're both pretty good promoters, and there was a lot of sound and fury coming in. If they found all the fraud, where were the indictments? I didn't see the indictments. If they found a bunch of waste and abuse, how come the proposed Trump budget has the fourth largest deficit in recorded history? How come the debt ceiling had to be raised? If you're as old as I, heaven forbid, you remember the Reagan Revolution. Unlike Trump, Reagan won by a landslide, and Reagan won specifically on an agenda to cut government. Uh, Trump had a lot of, rightist social agendas too, but Reagan was all about cutting the size of government. Um, David Stockman, a good friend of mine, was the director of the Office of Management and Budget in the Reagan years, and he wrote a wonderful book called The Triumph of Politics that describes the bipartisan Republican and Democrat derailing of the Reagan Revolution within 6 months of inauguration. If you lived through that period of time and paid attention, you understood that the Department of Government Efficiency was fraud itself, that it wasn't going to happen. Um, Mr. Trump, like most politicians, is a transactional human being. Uh, he's not particularly an ideologue. He uses ideology to get elected, but he's transactional. Uh, Policy is all about rewarding allies and punishing adversaries. In that sense, he's identical to Biden, who was similar to Bush, who was like Clinton. You know what I'm saying? And so, no, it was no surprise to me. It's unfortunate. I would love to have been wrong, but I thought the probability that I was wrong was minuscule. Unlike many commentators, I took the time to read Mr. Trump's book, The Art of the Deal. In The Art of the Deal, he talks about the fact that there is not two winners in a transaction. There's only one, and your job is to crowd the other person out of the transaction. Um, that's a typical political point of view. In business, ideally in a transaction, both the buyer and the seller won. So they get together and do business again. That's how businesses grow and how trust develops. But that's not how government works. Government's a zero sum game. So it was no surprise to me that unfortunately I was right about the failure of the Department of Government Efficiency. But with regards to gold, you're mostly right. I would argue, when people would say to me in interviews in 2022, 2023, when's the gold price going to move? I would scratch my chin sagely, and I would say, I think it's going to move in the year 2000. It was 250 bucks an ounce then. When they were asking me, the stuff was already over 2000. It had moved up eightfold, and people would say, when's it going to move? Perhaps they were looking for a more quantum move. In truth, I think you're right about the convergence of events. I think it was Hemingway, when asked how he went bankrupt, he said slowly at first, then all of a sudden. Uh, we have been building up unsustainable debts in our system for a long time, but at some point in time, it reaches the critical point. Many people, because the system is liquid, believe the system is solvent, and those are very, very, very different words. Imagine yourself having, let's say, $1 million in mortgage debt and an annual income of $65,000 and being overextended in your credit cards, that kind of thing. But you have $5,000 in your pocket. You're liquid, but you're not solvent. And I would suggest to you that that's the way that the United States is. And I would suggest that people are coming to reason to reason with it. When people say to me now, "Okay, Rick, accidentally you were right. The price is at $3,400. Have I waited too long? Has the gold bull market run its course? That's the next logical question, of course. And I answer that these days by uh, telling people what would cause me to sell my gold. And that's pretty easy. I will sell my gold when there's a real balanced budget in Washington, provided that that balanced budget provides for the timely repayment of $30 trillion in net on-balance sheet liabilities. In addition, there needs to be a fiscal plan to deal with the $100 trillion net present value of off-balance sheet liabilities, a politically feasible plan to deal with Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, federal government pensions, military pensions. So that has to happen. And there has to be a real positive interest rate. By positive interest rate, I mean that the interest on the U.S. 10-year Treasury has to exceed the rate in the deterioration of the purchasing power of the U.S. dollar. I believe that the U.S. dollar's purchasing power is proceeding at a compound rate between 7.5 or 8% a year. Uh, with the U.S. 10-year Treasury rate at what, 4.5? That would suggest a 10-year Treasury rate at 9.5. It would suggest a first mortgage rate at 12%. So when I see a positive real interest rate, when I see the end of quantitative easing, when I see a political accord that pays off $30 trillion in the net present value of not net present value, pardon me, in the aggregate value of government debt, and when I see a politically feasible plan to pay down or service $100 trillion in off-balance sheet liabilities, and oh yes, a balanced budget, I'll sell my gold. In 2024, the move in the gold price began to be substantial enough that margins in the more efficient producers happened. What you're starting to see now, a little bit, is the hangover from high grading. When you look at the income statement and the balance sheet of gold producers on a quarterly basis, an annual basis, it's important to look at the variance, which they have to report, between mined grade and average reserve grade, and find out if the company is in fact high grading. Because if they are high grading, what you will find is that in subsequent years, they'll have to pay a penalty for the relatively better results than they otherwise would have had to report were they not high grading. Tell them to go to the real classroom in Introduction to Natural Resource Investments, where I have 9.5 hours of programming for free about how you analyze juniors. So the first thing that they should do is invest in themselves. You're probably doing them a favor not to introduce them to me, by the way. A project which amuses me is we'd like to do something at the real classroom like Shark Tank, where we take all comers. Anybody who wants to come on and be interviewed by me can do so for a fee. We charge them, and it's live. And we put them through the same questions that we instruct our students at the real classroom to do. So let's give people a short form. First of all, luck favors the trained observer. The people around a junior have to have been successful previously in a task that's very similar to the task at hand. If your mythical junior comes to me and the guy says, I've been successful in mining, and it turns out that success was that he was the president of an operator in Archean terrain in French-speaking Quebec, but what he's doing today is exploring for gold in tertiary terrain in Spanish-speaking Peru, I'm not much interested because the success doesn't translate. The second thing is that I'm going to ask him or her, what is your most important unanswered question? Uh, how did you arrive at that question? In other words, what's your thesis? What facts support the question? How do you propose to answer the question? What is the answer worth? How long will it take and how much money will it take? I've been asking that same range of questions for 40 years. And 80% of the time I answer the question, the person I'm asking the question to says, I've never thought of it that way. Now, that's as though you're walking from San Francisco to Marin across the Golden Gate Bridge, and you're heading due east. If you don't have a plan, you are certain not to achieve your plan. When I ask people to describe their most important unanswered question, it turns out that for at least 80% of the respondees, their most important question is, will I be drawing a salary from this company 2 years from now or not? Yes or no? While I understand that's of interest to them, it's of no interest to me whatsoever. The second thing is that when I look at balance sheets and income statements, I notice that in most juniors, more than 50% of the capital raised gets spent on general and administrative expense, which is to say less than half goes in the ground. When I was in university, I learned that a mineralized anomaly had a 1 in 3,000 chance of becoming a mine. So my frontline odds are already lousy, 1 in 3,000. But if more than half the capital raised is going into G&A, not into the ground, the odds are by definition half as good as 1 in 3,000. So the person I'm talking to is going to have to explain to me why their general and administrative budget will be less than 20% of the capital that they raise. Uh, that would put them in the best decile of juniors worldwide. I would suggest to you that there are probably around 3,000 public companies worldwide that purport to be mining companies. US OTC, Australia, Canada, AIM, all this kind of thing. And I would suggest that between 85 and 90% of them are valueless. They're worth nothing. So I start with the proposition that 10% of the companies I talk to, I'll be interested in proceeding with. That hides the fact, on a positive side, that 5 or 10% of the listings generate so much performance, particularly in the market that we're coming into. Make no mistake, we're coming into a raging gold equities market. That they add legitimacy and even luster to an industry where 90% of the listings aren't worth the paper that they're printed on. So I hope at the Real Classroom that we can work through the regulatory challenges of allowing any prospective company that wants to meet me and wants to be introduced to the 70,000 investors who subscribe to my services, in a 1 hour session where they present their presentation, and then I respectfully but forcefully ask them questions around their presentation. I suspect that a company that got through that questioning in good order would be immediately rewarded by my investor base. And I suspect that some of the companies that went through that ordeal would never be able to raise money again. Have I waited too long? Has the gold bull market run its course? That's the next logical question, of course. And I answer that these days by uh, telling people what would cause me to sell my gold. And that's pretty easy.